Welcome to another episode of Congressional Conversations, where we discuss the priorities of New York's Jewish community with members of the New York Congressional Delegation. I'm your host, Michael Miller, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, JCRC-NY. And today, hailing from the 1st Congressional District, we welcome Representative Lee Zeldin. Representative Zeldin serves on both the House Committee on Financial Services and the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. He also serves as co-chairman of the House Republican Israel Caucus, in addition to serving as co-chair of the Long Island Sound Caucus. And it's my pleasure to welcome Congressman Zeldin.
Thank you. It's so great to be with you. Appreciate the invite.
Thank you. Great to have you on. So let's first talk about your personal background. We were talking before we went live about your military service, but let's start a little bit before that. And what was it within your upbringing that led you to go into public service and eventually to run for Congress?
A lot of it did have to do with my desire to serve in the military. I was fascinated and challenged by the prospect of serving the military, to try to wear the shoes of people who came before us. You would appreciate this as you came from a family where you're the 3rd generation to be serving in the military. I was intrigued and challenged by the desire with the spirit de corps, the discipline, being surrounded by people who believe in a cause greater than themselves, the camaraderie, especially, and our Constitution and our flag and our freedoms. So my desire to join the military ended up leading to a path where I joined Army ROTC and went on active duty. And that's where my desire primarily came from for public service, was out of a desire to wear the country's uniform.
Wow, that's really very, very meaningful. I know what it has felt like putting on the United States military uniform. I'm also U.S. Army when I served as an active duty chaplain, and you put on the Army uniform as well. It's a very, very special feeling, isn't it?
Yeah, I still remember the first time I put on the uniform and I looked in the mirror, I saw the U.S. Army patch smiling back at me. Thought of everyone who wore it before me, and I knew I had made the right decision to sign up.
And you served overseas in Iraq, if I remember correctly. So I very much, on behalf of all of our viewers, want to express our thanks for your service to our country and your continued service to our country as well.
Thank you.
I also saw that you also went to Hebrew school. So did your Jewish education also feed into your desire to perform service on behalf of the American people?
You know, that's a good question. I would say that it was probably not until maybe high school. I would have to try to pinpoint the exact moment where my head really started getting wrapped around the idea of serving in the military. I joined Hebrew school when I was in elementary school. Attended for a little bit beyond getting my bar mitzvah. It certainly impacted my character and my value system.
Yes.
I was surrounded by a rabbi and cantor and others who I looked up to very much. So it certainly kept me focused on what's right. And if I went back and I seriously reflected on life, that time with those around me in Hebrew school would certainly have made an impact related to my desire to serve in the military.
Thank you very much. We have a limited amount of time, and I want to get to quite a number of issues. So we'll first start locally with regard to the pandemic. At this stage, what have been your goals for supporting your district, particularly in the areas of housing, healthcare, and small business?
We've gone through different stages. At first, it was a desire to help secure PPE and other resources. I remember when we were working on getting from that federal state cooperation, but also with my local county, trying to secure the USNS Comfort to bring in ventilators, some medications, masks, gowns. That list goes on. I remember that not only the Javits Center, which everyone's familiar with, turning into a temporary field hospital, but there were other hospitals that got built, including one inside of Suffolk County. So there was a lot going on early. If you fast forward to today, a lot of focus on vaccines and when you hear from constituents with feedback on what's working and what's not working with the rollout to help communicate and advocate. And there's been several bipartisan bills that Congress has passed since the start of the pandemic. So helping a small business in my congressional district to obtain a paycheck protection program funding to help smooth out the rollout, to allow the deductibility of expenses. That timeline wasn't just something for the CARES Act towards the beginning of the process, but a lot of that effort has gone straight through to today. Advocating individually when certain businesses or individuals, nonprofits, others have reached out with their specific requests.
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask you about the nonprofit world that, of course, impacts on us, but also the role of houses of worship, which we're going to get to in a moment regarding security. But pertaining to healthcare, how have the hospitals out in Suffolk County been impacted? Do they have sufficient capacity at this point to handle the flow?
The hospitals were forced to get especially creative to increase capacity. I remember talking to one hospital CEO who was telling me about how they had put beds inside of a conference room, converting a conference room in their hospital. Another hospital CEO talking about how they're creative to try to get two people on one vent, multiple hospitals trying to do that. Also, the Department of Health and Human Services was allocated funding to distribute to high impact hospitals. And because the numbers were so high in my congressional district, there was a lot of advocacy to make sure that the regulations were written the right way to ensure that my local hospitals were all getting the funding that they needed. And if there was an issue that arose, to fight for them. So there, and PPE as well, big issue. There were many components to the effort to work with and fight for our local hospitals.
Thank you. I want to get to several questions that impact directly on our Jewish community. One of them is hate speech online. There have been a number of legislative proposals to combat hate speech online. What is your perspective on them, constitutional issues and tensions that you might recognize, and what other alternative action that we might take to combat online hatred, which is only growing?
There are many components to this. One, we have the debate over the liability protections and Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act. So that is a debate that I encourage and welcome in Congress. There's some changes that can and should be made there. I've also written to the Twitter CEO, Jack Dorsey, with regards to banning designated foreign terrorist organizations, where you see an account for Hamas officials or Iranian leadership talking about death to America, or the Chinese Communist Party had officials blaming the US military, saying that the United States military sent COVID-19 to China. I think that it's important for these US social media companies to be more proactive there. And you referenced the First Amendment. That is very important. We want to target bad actors. We want to combat hate speech online. And it's important for us to have the conversation when drafting regulation, when drafting legislation, to avoid an issue where you pass a bill into law and then it goes into the court system and then it gets overturned and you're back to square one. So it is a responsible conversation to have to address anyone's First Amendment concerns, for sure.
Thanks for the answer. But online hatred as well generates hatred directed towards our community, which we refer to as anti-Semitism, of course. And right before the pandemic struck, there was a spike over a period of years, but particularly several months around last Hanukkah. Of course, there was the attack in Poway, the Pittsburgh, then Poway, in Jersey City, and then in Muncie, just in Rockland County, just north of the city. The need to protect our Jewish community, we view ourselves as being highly vulnerable, is something which we are very concerned about, and our own organization in partnership with UJA established a community security initiative. We have a regional security manager in Long Island working together with our JCRC Long Island office. But this nonprofit security grant, the NSGP, which comes from the federal government through the Department of Homeland Security, the amount which is directed to the nonprofit security grant was boosted from $90 million to $180 million this past year. Their efforts are going to try to even double that to $360 million, which was passed in the House, but in the Senate, it was taken to back down to 180. But again, an increase from 90 to 180. What's most important is security for our houses of worship, our Jewish institutions. What efforts can you engage in as a representative of a very strong Jewish community in Suffolk County within the 1st Congressional District to ensure that the funding that's going into NSGP is as generous as it can be?
This funding is very important to be able to secure houses of worship. I think it's important for House and Senate, Republican, Democrat, regardless of where you are from in the country, for everybody to work together on a bipartisan basis to build up support. It's also important that the money is not just spent as effectively and efficiently as possible, but we're also educating houses of worship so that they know what grant programs are out there, specifically through this grant, how to help a house of worship to be able to apply and be successful through that process. And when we go through the appropriations process, the federal government, as you know, has a fiscal year that ends at the end of September. We have to ensure that as we go from one fiscal year to the next, that we are demonstrating the need, that we have the applications coming in, that those applications are strong, that the bipartisanship is also strong, to make sure that the funding is out there to secure these houses of worship. It's incredibly important. The federal government needs to do its part to assist.
Right. Thanks for all your work and your assistance in making sure that NSGP is approved and that the funding does come in to our not-for-profit, particularly our religious institutions. One of course, the direct results of anti-Semitism is Holocaust denial. And how can we work together to ensure that bills such as the Never Again Act are fully implemented so Holocaust education is emphasized? And what are additional legislative measures to provide complete Holocaust education to all New Yorkers?
Yeah, and you bring up the education and awareness need. This legislation that you referenced, the Never Again Act. I was so thrilled, honored to be part of the effort to get this over the finish line. And now we have to implement it, and ensuring that congressional intent as well as the law is being honored with relationships in the Department of Education. And also the communication with the state departments of education. I come from New York. It's critical for there to not just be a good line of communication between the state and the federal, but also in New York, we have over 700 different school districts. We have tests that might be created at one level. We have a curriculum that may be set at another level, standards that might be set at another level. And what we need to make sure and advocate for is that that we see Holocaust education not just becoming an item to check a box for a classroom and a teacher, but to actually formally make it part of curriculum, standards, and testing, and to make sure it's as effective as possible in every school district.
Yes, absolutely correct. And I also want to thank you for being among the leaders in Congress, ensuring that Holocaust education is not only acted upon, but implemented. And one of the things that I understand that you have also led is that you are the co-chair of the Holocaust Insurance Accountability Act, And can you explain to our viewers what that is and why it's so crucial at this point? I just want to mention as well that my late father was the president for the last 20 years of his life of the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, the Claims Conference. So this issue is very important to me and my family as well. So again, the Holocaust Insurance Accountability Act. What is it, and why is it so important?
This is legislation that I've introduced in the House of Representatives as the Republican lead with Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida. Debbie and I also host the bipartisan Hanukkah party on Capitol Hill every December. And that effort has continued with this legislation as well, which creates a pathway for Holocaust survivors and their heirs to resolve unpaid insurance claims. For many of them, their rights were negotiated away during the International Commission on Holocaust-era Insurance Claims. So we need to create a vehicle in law to allow survivors and their heirs to finally have their day in court. They deserve their day in court. And that's why I've been honored to co-lead this effort. And for anyone who's listening, if you have a relationship with a member of Congress in the House or Senate, Republican or Democrat, getting them to co-sponsor this bill would be a big help.
Yeah, indeed. And we do hope that our listeners follow through on that. Let's shift now to Israel in the remaining minutes that we have. As the co-chair, and we thank you for that, the co-chair of the House Republican Israel Caucus, what's your ideal Israel policy platform, and what do you see as the future of U.S.-Israel relations?
For one, it should not be a partisan issue. The best way to strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship is to have strong bipartisan support in both parties working hard at every opportunity to strengthen that bond between our two nations. I view Israel as the greatest ally there is of the United States. And I know I have many colleagues who feel strongly the same way. We've all experienced that first trip to Israel where you can see firsthand just how special of a nation this is. And the alliance isn't just a strategic one where we need to continue to honor the memorandum of understanding, provide support with development of certain defense articles that help Israel defend itself, but also whether it relates to intelligence, technology, energy, and agriculture, and so much more. There's a lot for the United States to gain out of strengthening that bond. There's a lot for Israel to gain out of it. My background, as you mentioned earlier, is in the military. I've actually lost more friends due to post-traumatic stress disorder than I did in combat. And that's why I have co-led a bipartisan bill for PTSD research between our two countries. So while we might be talking about some of the higher profile issues that our alliance faces, we may be talking about the Iran nuclear deal or other high profile items of the day. There are many ways for our countries to work together. And the best way for us to do that is for both parties to be fierce in their advocacy for strengthening that bond.
Well, thank you so much for that, again, for your leadership on Israel-related issues. Speaking of Israel, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is of concern to us. What actions have you taken or supported in order to oppose BDS?
I co-authored a resolution that passed in the summer of 2019 with Congressman Brad Schneider. He was the lead Democrat. I was the lead Republican. It came for a vote in the House. It had a strong bipartisan vote. It was overwhelming. It was so encouraging to see both parties coming together like that to condemn the BDS movement. I woke up the next day more motivated than ever to want to pass legislation with teeth. Last Congress, S1 passed the Senate with almost 80% of the senators voting for it. Unfortunately, it didn't come up for a vote in the House. I think it would be fantastic to pass it now. And that's legislation that would, that S1 included the Combating BDS Act, and that allows state and local governments to take more action to combat BDS. we need to identify, confront, and crush anti-Semitism. And we need to understand that so much of the BDS movement in the name of BDS has gone far beyond legitimate criticism of a government. It's been blatant anti-Semitism, and it's one of the main reasons why I very strongly oppose BDS and will do everything in my power to help combat it.
Thank you. And I'm sure you also oppose the regime in Tehran. What do you see happening should the Biden administration re-engage with Iran? What role should America should Congress actually be taking?
Well, when engaging with Iran, and for that matter, with any country in the world, it's always important to learn lessons from the past. One of those lessons learned is not to set red lines for talks unless you are set on enforcing those red lines. That's very important. We saw some of those mistakes made with the original negotiation of the JCPOA. We also don't want to set dates on our side that only we care about, but the Iranians don't care about. Where we say that we have to reach a deal by March 31st, and the Iranians could care less whether or not there's a deal by March 31st. We lose some leverage there. We also have to have the mentality that you can't look at a bad deal as being better than no deal. You have to have a willingness to walk away from the table if you're not getting an acceptable agreement. And as you look at the JCPOA, you have sunset provisions that are now very quickly approaching that have to either be significantly extended or just removed. Learn lessons of vulnerabilities in the verification agreement, strengthen that. There are some non-nuclear activities of Iran that if you're going to negotiate away the leverage that brings Iranians to the table, you have to take care of some of these other items. For example, the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles come to mind. So those are some basic principles, lessons learned from the past, and ways to go into talks in a stronger position and to make sure that we don't surrender that very strong position where Iran is able to take advantage of us at the table.
And thank you. And lastly, with regard to Hezbollah and the Hamas and the role that Iran plays, the malign role that it plays in supporting those terrorist groups, how do you propose that we in the United States can combat this influence in the region?
Part of it is connected to our last question and conversation about Iran. There's a relationship between some of these bad actors in the region and Iran. There are sanctions that certainly can't be lifted. We have to maintain that leverage. Hezbollah has 150,000 rockets and missiles all aimed at Israel. We need to have up-to-date intelligence. We need to know location. These are lethal existential threats to Israel. We need to recognize Israel's inherent right to self-defense, view an attack on Israel as an attack on us. That's how strong the bond should be between our countries. I introduced legislation last Congress called the Countering Hezbollah in Lebanon's Military Act. Whether it's legislation or it's the State Department and others from the executive branch, the president, the vice president, the United Nations, we have some other leverage points that we need to stay strong and firm and make sure that we don't weaken Israel's ability to defend itself by failing to be honest brokers where we no longer are good arbiters. We have to be honest with ourselves and honest with the international community in order to ensure that that we don't have a great ally attacked. It's in our best interest to be aggressive and sometimes with foreign aid, sometimes with UN Security Council actions. We'll see with the JCPOA negotiation. There are many tools available to us to confront Hezbollah and Hamas, and I just named a few of them.
So thank you very much, Congressman Zeldin, for joining us on Congressional Conversations. To our audience who is watching, we thank you for viewing. And to learn more about the issues we discussed today, you can check out JCRC-NY's 2021 Focus on Communal Priorities, available at jcrc.org. See you next time on Congressional Conversations. Thank you. Shalom.